In this Rilma tutorial, we are going to take a look at two-stage forced induction. In this tutorial, I am going to assume that you are adept at tuning naturally aspirated engines as well as turbocharged engines and supercharged engines already. Two-stage forced induction is usually something that you will never need for normal cars in citation marks. Because you have wonderful technology like variable geometry turbos that pretty much do the same job. But in extreme cases, or when you want to get fancy, you might want to consider two-stage compression if you know how to deal with it. And that is exactly where we get back to our inline-4 2-liter basic naturally aspirated engine that we are going to use as a baseline for forced induction. There are two different types of two-stage forced induction in automation, but those two types can be used in total 4 different ways. We're going to cover all of them. The order in which we are going to cover these different two-stage compression methods are that we start with twincharging, first in a pure compounding way, then in a sequential way. Then we switch over to compound turbos, where we use them in a pure compounding way and then in their sequential way. What I mean by pure compounding and sequential is, in this case, that in a pure compounding way, they always assist each other. They always contribute throughout the rev range, both of them, to build pressure, while in a sequential way, I mean that one starts to overpower the other one and completely takes over. Check out the timestamps below if you are looking for one of those specific approaches. And now, let's get started. We start off with pure compounding twincharging. And we are going to use our basic 2-liter inline-4 as a baseline, and now prepare it for some boost. To do that, let's switch over to some heftier bottom end, do the standard things of lowering compression, stiffening up the springs, probably lowering cam profile just a smidge, and opening up the header as well as exhaust, and don't forget about the manifold. Now we are ready to do some twincharging. Let's see what happens. It explodes! And this is probably one of the reasons for why you're watching this video. Let's get this sorted. The easiest approach to start tuning a twincharge setup is to take the turbo out of the picture for the most part. What we can do is the turbo is first in line, so it provides pressure to the supercharger. So what we can do is just to take out the turbo by making it huge and setting the boost limit to basically nothing. This means that we are now working with only a supercharger. And setting up a supercharger you already know from a previous tutorial. So let's do this. And there we are. That was a very easy setup. Basically, for modern days, you go below half the size of the engine, and then you are somewhere around a gear ratio of 2x or so. Now let's take a look at the path through the compressor map of the supercharger. And now we need to understand one very important principal thing about two-stage compression. This curve is the multiplier to your absolute pressure at the inlet of the supercharger. So it comes into the turbo at atmospheric pressure. The turbo produces some boost. That boost is added onto the atmospheric pressure. That absolute pressure reaches the inlet, and that absolute pressure is then multiplied by, say, 1.5. When you're dealing with a purely compounding setup, you want to share the load. So now, let's start by adding back in the turbo. As you see, it didn't do anything, basically. Take back the turbine size to something more reasonable in relation to the overall compressor size. And now let's see where we need to end up in order to spool this thing. Also, it doesn't explode, as you see, which is a bonus. There's a little bit more in it, and to do easier math, let's say we boost it to 2 bars absolute pressure, which you can, for the first stage, just outright see here. Pressure ratio corresponds, in that case, to absolute pressure. That changes when we now switch over to the supercharger. Again, this line is your multiplier to absolute pressure. So we get in there at 2 bars of absolute pressure, and now we are multiplying it with the blue line. Let's try to aim for an absolute overall pressure in the system after the supercharger of around 3 bar, which means 2 bars of boost. That would mean that we want to have the blue line sitting around 1.5. Pretty easy to accomplish here, as we just need to increase the gearing ratio a little, and there we are. Retune your turbo size a little to make it not go into extreme mass flows, as we now flow even more air than before. And now this is all looking good. Look at how easy it is to produce 2 bars of boost when you're using 2-stage compression. Neither of the stages has to put in hard work. If we were to do it with a turbocharger alone, we would be up here in the compressor map. And you see how narrow a range you have there to actually do tuning. There's one thing in particular that you might be running into when you're trying to create high pressure versions of these setups, and that is that your supercharger seals are going to pop out. For a zero quality supercharger, that is very easy to exemplify by just upping the slider here a little bit, and you can see the pressure stress rising and go pop, even though we are just at a pressure ratio of 1.7. Well, overall, the pressure is, of course, a lot higher than just 1.5 bar. If you are running a twin charge setup and want to have lots of boost, you better make sure that you quality engineer it so that it can handle it. You will see that this pressure stress will go away real quickly as you are increasing quality. Once you're done, of course, we just do our standard retuning. And once you have done that, we are done with the setup. 3.4 bars of absolute pressure, which is coming from a turbo that applies a multiplier of 2, and a supercharger that then multiplies the result with 1.7. While neither of them are particularly stressed. Very nice. For the twin-charged sequential setup, we again start out with our basic inline-4 engine that has been retuned to accept some proper boost, and now we can switch it over to being twin-charged. Once again, let's take out the turbo from the picture and just focus on the supercharger. The sequential twin-charged setup is unique in that the supercharger boosts the engine for lower RPM, and then the turbo takes over and completely overpowers the supercharger so that it can disengage at higher RPM. In order to do that, naturally, you will need a different control method, at least a clutch. The clutch automatically kicks in when the supercharger reaches its RPM limit. So let us gauge where that would be and just increase the gearing when you already have about-ish the right size. You see here, this last little bit is when the clutch kicks in and the supercharger is taken out of the picture. What this allows us to do is to build more boost earlier. However, you will notice that the disengagement point tends to be really high up the rev range compared to how high you already are in terms of boost and how much the supercharger can take. And that is why you want to be using, for this kind of setup, the sequential type of twin charging, always go for the advanced control. If you do not have access to the advanced control and with it the boost limit, then this will be a really, really difficult setup. And often just not really productive either. So let's use the advanced control setup here, which allows us to limit the boosts that we see after the supercharger. Of course, this boost limit is not specific to the supercharger alone, but rather the combined effect of the turbo and the supercharger. And that means that if we set a 2-bar limit here, and then set the turbo to also be at a 2-bar limit, and then tune the turbo such that it actually reaches its 2 bars limit, you will see that the supercharger is now experiencing the total boost limit set by the advanced control, where its multiplicative effect is diminished as soon as the 2 bars in total have been reached and its multiplier doesn't need to be as high anymore, so it starts dropping. This is approximately where you would want to shoot for, so that you pass through the green island of efficiency there, and then at some point it disengages completely. But what this allows you to do is to quite severely up the gearing, which allows you to get higher boosts at lower RPM. So again, the same concept applies. Turbocharger gives you a baseline absolute pressure, in this case 3 bar, which then is being multiplied by the supercharger. But because we have set a limit of 2 bars of boost, which is 3 bars of absolute pressure, that means the supercharger has to do absolutely nothing and can fully open up its bypass valve as well as disengage from being turned and just let the turbocharger work, which is exactly this point you're seeing there, where the supercharger disengages and doesn't provide any more friction to the engine. This is why you get this little kink. Switching over to the friction mean effective pressure graph, you will see what is happening. The supercharger is ramping up at 2000 RPM, around-ish, it hits its maximum, and then the turbocharger takes over and the supercharger needs to do less and less of the compression until it is fully disengaged and produces 0 Newton meters of friction. The advanced control also disengages the supercharger once the input pressure already has hit the boost limit. And that means that you don't necessarily have to rev it out to the end until it disengages, which would be the behavior of just using the clutch. And there you have it, a fully tuned, twin-charged sequential setup. Now let's talk about pure compounding setups. And this time around that is done with 2 turbochargers instead of using a turbocharger and supercharger combination. Compound Turbo is the name, and let's set it up, and wow, this is working out of the box. Of course, I'm basing this on an already prepared naturally aspirated engine, our standard inline 4 2-liter. With this working out of the box with default settings, of course, that is a little bit of a helping hand. But what do you do if it doesn't work, or if you want to have a proper from-scratch kind of setup? That means that you first need a target. With a target of an absolute pressure of 3 bar, or a boost of 2 bar in total, we need to now figure out how much each turbo should be doing. For this, you can just set both turbos to absolutely no size and no boost and start with a naturally aspirated engine. Your aim in the setup should be that both turbos do about-ish the same amount of pressure ratio work. As we have seen in the twin-charging setup, we know that if you put 1 bar of boost on the first turbo, then you need to multiply it with 1.5 pressure ratio for the second one. But that means that the second stage only does like half the work of the first stage. So we want to meet in the middle somewhere. A pressure ratio of 2 for the first stage would mean that we have 1 bar of boost, but we want to stay a little bit below so that they share the load. So let's put it at something like 0.7. The absolute pressure of 3 bars the target, so you now have to divide 3 bars by 1.7. What you are doing instead is setting the boost pressure to a maximum of 2 bars, because that gives you the absolute pressure of 3 bars that you wanted, while you will be seeing a pressure ratio of 1.75, roughly. So, if we now start tuning our turbo sizes, what we should see is that they both about-ish end up at 1.7. Which order you do them in at this point doesn't really matter, so let's start with the low pressure one. Start out slowly, not too aggressively, with plenty of headspace there. Now let's do the same thing for the high pressure turbo, and we see that yes, they are now building about-ish the pressure ratios that we are expecting. And you did see that as soon as we tuned the high pressure turbo, the low pressure turbo line got way further into the compressor map, so keep that in mind when you are setting up the low turbo first, that this will have to be a larger map in terms of flow than what you are expecting when you just set it up without the high pressure turbo being there, or working. Now tune the high pressure side until it gives you a good path through the map. And something that you will notice is that you will need a smaller secondary turbo, a high pressure turbo that is smaller in size than the low pressure turbo. And that is simply because the input pressure is already higher than atmospheric for the high pressure one, so it doesn't need as much space to do the same work as the low pressure version. That also means that it is actually going to spool first, which is why you see this line go to a higher pressure ratio and then drop to its equilibrium where they both are fully working. And now let's retune the low pressure turbo, and don't forget to adjust the tune of the turbo so that you have a better fit for the compressor map versus the path through it. Alright, this is looking pretty solid. So what do we have here? A low pressure turbo that produces 0.7 bars of boost, so pressure ratio 1.7, and then it is being multiplied by a pressure ratio of 1.75 for the second stage, or 1.76 really. It is going up to an absolute pressure of 3 bars without breaking a sweat, thanks to the 2-stage compression. Again, a reminder what that would mean if you were using one single turbo, we would be up there. Now a quick retune of the engine, and we're done. A beautifully relaxed setup producing 2 bars of boost. And now we are ready to tackle the fourth and final variation of Twincharging, which is using a compound setup in a sequential manner. The baseline engine is prepared, so now we can select the compound turbo again and see what happens. The gist of the sequential compound setup is the same as for the twin-charged sequential setup, where the supercharger was, in air quotes, spooling first to then take in the turbo, which then starts to overpower the supercharger and then disconnects it. With the compound turbo setup, you can do exactly the same thing. The principle behind the setup is reasonably simple if you have followed along so far. We set the overall limit of boost to something that we are aiming for instance 2 bar. Just like in the case with the twin-charge sequential setup, you do want to use an advanced control mechanism in order to avoid all kinds of complications. So let's use Smart Boost here and start by tuning the low pressure turbo, because this is our final stage. Once you have done that, we can switch over to the high pressure turbo and see that it is behaving the way we would expect. The pressure ratio is rising quickly and then falling as soon as the low pressure turbo, i.e. our stage 2, does manage to overpower it. So what we really want to do is to make the high pressure turbo as small as possible so that it spools as early as possible. If you're going really aggressive, there is at the moment some chance of getting some oscillations here because of the large fluctuation in efficiencies and the limited fidelity in calculation resolution. So just keep that in mind and try to find a setting that doesn't blow your socks off. If you want to push how aggressive you are, you can always try to mitigate it by having a slightly lower boost limit on the second stage than on the first, so that it's always doing something. Just a little bit. Kind of spinning there, being along for the ride. And with that, we were able to push the fully spooled level down to 2000 RPM for this engine, which is, at 2000 RPM, you are at 3 bars of absolute pressure. And there we have it. A really nicely set up sequential compound turbo setup that reaches 2 bars of boost. And now I think it is time to have a final summary discussion of when to actually use which setup. In general, you can say that if you want to use reasonable amounts of boost, and by reasonable I mean a maximum of 1 to 1.5 bars of boost, it is almost always better to use single stage compression, because variable turbos are quite potent. And that is exactly why we do not see twin-charge setups or compound setups in normal road cars all that often. If you want to have really high boost pressures, then the pure compounding ways, for racing applications at least, are the ways to go, because you're always retaining a reasonably high amount of RPM and thus can use the compounding effect throughout your used rev range. And while it is not a perfect one-to-one comparison, because I did tune things slightly differently, the overall boost pressure is the same for these two, which is comparing the twin-charge sequential setup that you have in the solid lines versus the compound sequential setup that you have in the dashed line. You see, the advantage of the compound setup is overall higher performance at a higher RPM, but higher RPM here means from 2000 RPM. However, what should be noted is that a compound turbo setup, even when used sequentially, is pretty dire for throttle response, while a twin-charge sequential setup is a little bit better. It does also provide you with a little more extra grunt down in the very low RPM range. When it comes to the purely compounding setups, twin-charged and compound turbos, then comparing these two will give you something like this, although let's retune this one to actually have the same boost pressure real quick. Alright, this will be a fairer comparison because that nets us the same amount of boost as the compared to variant, and you see, compound turbocharging is quite a bit more efficient, but what you also see is that the responsiveness of the compound turbo, pure compounding turbo setup is as bad as it gets. Another advantage of the twin-charging compounding setup is that it is quite easy to tune. And also just a little bit more satisfying to see how your multiplier curve is trundling along through the island of efficiency. So in summary, if you need a high boost performance engine, two-stage compression is the way to go in order to make the best use of the turbos. It is a complex setup, it is difficult to set up, but it will mean that you can build a lot of boost pressure without stressing the turbos all that much. That is for any pressure that you want beyond, let's say, 1.8-ish bars of boost, where this kind of setup really starts to shine. Twin charging works really quite well if you are in the mid-ish range of boost pressures, like say 1.2 to 1.5, so quite high but not extreme, and you want to have a little bit of extra grunt, and I'm pointing towards the wrong thing, the sequential setup there, where you are wanting to have a little bit more throttle response for your sportiness, and can make some sacrifices in terms of overall performance. If, however, you are going to the lower side of the boost spectrum, then one stage is always the way to go. A variable geometry turbo will cover a very large range of RPM and will accomplish pretty much the same thing with less complexity and more reliability. And that's saying something for variable geometry turbo. Also, it is way easier to set up, and it is less expensive too. And with that, we are done here, and I hope this has provided you a little glimpse into how the world of two-stage compression works within automation.